5A. Right, we're going to continue again with a chapter of Howl's Moving Castle. This is chapter 3. If you want to read along with this, the link is in the description down there, and this starts right at the bottom of page 12, if you'd like to read along. Chapter 3, in which Sophie enters into a castle and a bargain. There was a large black door in the black wall facing Sophie, and she made for that, hobbling briskly. The castle was uglier than ever close to. It was far too tall for its height, and not like a regular shape. As far as Sophie could see in the growing darkness, it was built of huge black blocks like coal, and like coal, these blocks were different shapes and sizes. Chill breathed off these blocks as she got closer, but that failed to frighten Sophie at all. She just thought of chairs and firesides and stretched her hand out eagerly to the door. Her hand could not come near it. Some invisible wall stopped her hand about a foot from the door. Sophie prodded at it with an irritable finger. When that made no difference, she prodded with her stick. The wall seemed to be all over the door, from as high as her stick could reach right down to the heather sticking out from under the doorstep. "Open up!" Sophie cackled at it. That made no difference to the wall. "Very well," Sophie said. "I'll find your back door." She hobbled off the left-hand corner of the castle, being both the nearest and slightly downhill. But she couldn't get around the corner. The invisible wall stopped her again, as soon as she was level with the irregular black cornerstones. At this, Sophie said a word that she learned from Martha that neither old ladies nor young girls are supposed to know, and stumped uphill and anti-clockwise to the castle's right-hand corner. There was no barrier there. She turned that corner and came hobbling eagerly towards the second big black door in the middle of that side of the castle. There was a barrier over that one too. Sophie glowered at it. "I call that very unwelcoming," she said. Black smoke blew down from the battlements in clouds. Sophie coughed. Now she was angry. She was old, frail, chilly, and aching all over. Night was coming on, and the castle just sat and blew smoke at her. "I'll speak to Howl about this," she said, and set off fiercely to the next corner. There was not a barrier there. Evidently you had to go around the castle clockwise, but there, a bit sideways into the next wall, was a third door. This one was much smaller and shabbier. The back door, at last. The castle started to move again as Sophie got near the back door. The ground shook, the wall shuddered and creaked, and the door started to travel sideways from her. "Oh, no, you don't," Sophie shouted. She ran after the door and hit it violently with her stick. "Open up!" she yelled. The door sprang open inwards, still moving sideways. Sophie, by hobbling furiously, managed to get one foot on its doorstep. Then she hopped and scrambled and hopped again, while the great black blocks rolled round the door, jolted and crunched as the castle gathered speed over the uneven hillside. Sophie wondered that the castle had a lopsided look. The marvel was it didn't fall apart on the spot. "What a stupid way to treat a building," she panted as she threw herself inside it. She had to drop her stick and hang on to the open door in order not to be jolted straight out again. When she began to get her breath, she realized there was a person standing in front of her, holding the door too. He was a head taller than Sophie, but she could see he was the merest child, only a little older than Martha, and he seemed to be trying to shut the door on her and push her out of the warm, lamplit, low-beamed room beyond him into the night again. "Don't you have the impudence to shut the door on me, my boy," she said. "I wasn't going to, but you're keeping the door open," he protested. "What do you want?" Sophie looked round at what she could see beyond the boy. There were a number of probably wizardly things hanging from the beams. Strings of onions, bunches of herbs, bundles of strange roots. There were also definitely wizardly things, like leather books and crooked bottles and an old, brown, grinning human skull. On the other side of the boy was a fireplace, with a small fire burning in the grate. It was a much smaller fire than all the smoke outside suggested, and this was obviously only a back room in the castle. Much more important to Sophie, this fire had reached the glowing rosy stage with little blue flames dancing on the logs, and placed beside it, in the warmest position, was a low chair with a cushion on it. Sophie pushed the boy aside and dived for the chair. "Ah, my fortune," she said, settling herself comfortably into it. It was bliss. The fire warmed her aches, and the chair supported her back, and she knew that if anyone wanted to turn her out now, they were going to have to use extreme and violent magic to do it. The boy shut the door. Then he picked up Sophie's stick and politely leaned it against the chair for her. Sophie realised there was now no sign at all the castle was moving across the hillside, not even the ghost of a rumble or the tiniest shaking. How odd. "Tell Wizard Howl," she said to the boy, "this castle is going to come apart around his ears if it travels much further." "Well, the castle's bespelled to hold together," the boy said, "but I'm afraid Howl's not here just at the moment." This was good news to Sophie. "When will he be back?" she asked a little nervously. "Probably not until tomorrow now," the boy said. "What do you want? Can I help you instead? I'm Howl's apprentice, Michael." This was better news than ever. "I'm afraid only the wizard can possibly help me," Sophie said quickly and firmly. It was probably true too. "I'll wait if you don't mind." It was clear that Michael did mind. He hovered around her a little helplessly. To make it plain she had no intention of being turned out by a boy apprentice, Sophie closed her eyes and pretended to go to sleep. "Tell him my name's Sophie," she murmured. "Old Sophie," she added to be on the safe side. "That'll probably mean waiting all night," Michael said. Since this was exactly what Sophie wanted, she pretended not to hear. In fact, she almost certainly fell into a swift doze. She was so tired from all that walking. At that moment, Michael gave her up and went back to the work he was doing at the workbench where the lamp stood. So she would have a whole night's shelter, even if it was on slightly false pretenses. Sophie thought drowsily. Since Howl was such a wicked man, it probably served him right to be imposed upon. But she intended to be well away from here by the time Howl came back and raised objections. She looked sleepily and slyly across at the apprentice. It rather surprised her to find him such a nice, polite boy. After all, she'd forced her way in rudely, and Michael hadn't complained at all. Perhaps Howl kept him in abject servility. But Michael didn't look servile. He was a tall, dark boy with a pleasant, open sort of face, and he was most respectably dressed. In fact, if Sophie hadn't seen him at that moment carefully pouring green fluid out of a crooked flask onto black powder in a bent glass jar, she would have taken him for the son of a prosperous farmer. How odd. Still, things were bound to be odd where wizards were concerned, Sophie thought, and this kitchen or workshop was beautifully cosy and very peaceful. Sophie went properly to sleep and snored. She didn't wake up when there came a flash and a muted bang from the workbench, followed by a hurriedly bitten off swear word from Michael. She didn't wake when Michael, sucking his burnt fingers, put the spell aside for the night and fetched bread and cheese out of the closet. She didn't stir when Michael knocked her stick down with a clatter, reaching over her for a log to put a log on the fire, or when Michael, looking down into Sophie's open mouth, remarked to the fireplace, "She's got all her own teeth. She's not the witch of the waste, is she?" I wouldn't have let her come in if she was," the fireplace retorted. Michael shrugged and picked up Sophie's stick politely again. Then he put a log on the fire with equal politeness and went away to bed somewhere overhead. In the middle of the night, Sophie was wakened by someone snoring. She jumped upright, rather irritated to discover she was the one who seemed to have been snoring. It seemed to her she'd only dropped off for a second or so, but Michael seemed to have vanished in those seconds, taking the light with him. No doubt a wizard's apprentice learned to do that kind of thing in his first week, and he'd left the fire very low. It was giving out irritating hissings and poppings, A cold draught blew on Sophie's back. Sophie recalled she was in a wizard's castle, and also, with unpleasant distinctness, there was a human skull on a workbench somewhere behind her. She shivered and cranked her stiff old neck around, but there was only darkness behind her. "Let's have a bit more light, shall we?" she said. Her cracked voice seemed to make no more noise than the crackling of the fire. Sophie was surprised. She'd expected it to echo through the vaults of the castle. Still, there was a basket of logs beside her. She stretched out a creaking arm and heaved a log on the fire, which sent a spray of green and blue sparks flying through the chimney. She heaved on a second log and sat back, not without a nervous look or so behind her, where the blue-purple light from the fire was dancing over the polished brown bone of the skull. The room was quite small. There was no one in it but Sophie and the skull. "He's got both feet in the grave, and I've only got one," she consoled herself. She turned back to the fire, which was now flaring up into blue and green flames. "Must be salt in that wood," Sophie murmured. She settled herself more comfortably, putting her knobby feet on the fender and her head into a corner of the chair, where she could stare into the coloured flames, and began dreamily considering what she ought to do in the morning. But she was sidetracked a little by imagining a face in the flames. "It would be a thin blue face," she murmured, "very long and thin, with a thin blue nose. But those curly green flames on top are most definitely your hair. Suppose I didn't go until Howl gets back. Wizards can lift spells, I suppose. And those two purple flames near the bottom make the mouth. You have savage teeth, my friend. You have two green tufts of flame for eyebrows." Curiously enough, the only orange flames in the fire were under the green flames, just like eyes, and they each had a little purple glint in the middle that Sophie could almost imagine was looking at her like the pupil of an eye. "On the other hand," Sophie continued, looking into the orange flames, "if the spell was off, I'd have my heart eaten before I could even turn around." "Don't you want your heart eaten?" asked the fire. It was definitely the fire that spoke. Sophie saw its purple mouth move as the words came. Its voice was nearly as cracked as her own, full of the spitting and whining of burning wood. "Naturally I don't," Sophie answered. "What are you?" "A fire demon," answered the purple mouth. There was more whine than spit to its voice as it said to it, "I am bound to this hearth by contract. I can't move from this spot." Then its voice became brisk and crackling. "And what are you?" it asked. "I can see you're under a spell." This roused Sophie from her dreamlike state. "You see?" she explained. "Can you take the spell off?" There was a popping, blazing silence while the orange eyes in the demon's wavering blue face travelled up and down Sophie. "It's a strong spell," it said at length. "It feels like one of the Witch of the Wastes to me." "It is," said Sophie. "But it seems more than that," crackled the demon. "I detect 2 layers, and of course you won't be able to tell anyone about it unless they know already." It gazed at Sophie a moment longer. "I shall have to study it," it said. "How long will that take?" Sophie asked. "It may take a while," said the demon, and it added in a soft, persuasive flicker, "How about making a bargain with me? I'll break your spell if you agree to break this contract I'm under." Sophie looked warily at the demon's thin blue face. It had a distinctly cunning look as it made this proposal. Everything she'd read showed the extreme danger of making a bargain with a demon, and there was no doubt that this one did look extraordinarily evil. Those long purple teeth. "Are you sure you're being quite honest?" she said. "Not completely," admitted the demon. "But do you want to stay like that until you die? That spell has shortened your life by about 60 years, if I'm any judge of such things." This was a nasty thought, and one which Sophie had tried not to think about up to now. It made quite a difference. "The contract you're under," she said. "It's with Wizard Howl, is it?" "Of course," said the demon. Its voice took on a bit of a whine again. "I'm fastened to this hearth, and I can't stir so much as a foot away. I'm forced to do most of the magic around here. I have to maintain the castle and keep it moving and do all the special effects that scare people off, as well as anything else Howl wants. Howl's quite heartless, you know." Sophie didn't need telling that Howl was heartless. On the other hand, the demon was probably quite as wicked. "Don't you get anything out of this contract at all?" she said. "I wouldn't have entered into it if I didn't," the demon flickered sadly. "But I wouldn't have done it if I knew what it would be like. I'm being exploited." In spite of her cautions, Sophie felt a good deal of sympathy for the demon. She thought of herself making hats for Fanny while Fanny went gadding. "All right," she said. "What are the terms of the contract? How do I break it?" An eager purple grin spread across the demon's face. "You agree to a bargain?" "If you agree to break the spell on me," Sophie said, with a brave sense of saying something fatal. "Done!" cried the demon, his long face leaping gleefully up the chimney. "I'll break your spell the very instant you break my contract." "Then tell me how I break your contract," Sophie said. The orange eyes glinted at her and looked away. "I can't. Part of the contract is neither the wizard or I can say what the main clause is." Sophie saw that she'd been tricked. She opened her mouth to tell the demon it could sit in the fireplace until doomsday if that was the case. The demon realized she was going to. "Don't be hasty," it crackled. "You can find out what it is if you watch and listen carefully. I implore you to try. The contract isn't doing either of us any good in the long run, and I do keep my word. The fact that I'm stuck here shows that I keep my word." It was in earnest, leaping about on its logs in an agitated way. Sophie felt a great deal of sympathy. "But if I'm to watch and listen, that means I have to stay here in Howl's castle," she objected. "Oh, only about a month. Remember, I have to study for your spell too," the demon pleaded. "But, what possible excuse can I give for doing that?" Sophie asked. We'll think of one. Howl's pretty useless at most things." "In fact," the demon said, venomously hissing, "he's too wrapped up in himself to see beyond his nose half the time. We can deceive him, as long as you'll agree to stay." "Very well," Sophie said. "I'll stay. I'll now find an excuse." "Very well." She settled herself comfortably in the chair while the demon thought. It thought aloud in a little crackling, flickering murmur, which reminded Sophie rather of the way she talked to her stick when she walked here. And it blazed while it thought, such a glad, powerful roaring, she dozed again. She thought the demon did make a few suggestions. She remembered shaking her head to the notion that she should pretend to be Howl's long-lost great-aunt, and to two other ones even more far-fetched, but she didn't remember very clearly. The demon at length fell to singing a gentle, flickering little song. It wasn't in any language Sophie knew, or she thought not, until she distinctly heard the word saucepan in it several times, and it was very sleepy sounding. Sophie fell into a deep sleep, with a slight suspicion that she was being bewitched now as well as beguiled, but it didn't bother her particularly. She would be free of the spell soon. Interesting. Okay, check out check out Seesaw. There will be an activity about this. All right. Thanks for listening. See you again.